Hello everyone, we are still in joint and solidary obligations. This is the second to the last topic before your midterm exam. Our last topic will be modes of extinguishment of obligations. Let us first read Article 1207 and Article 1208. Under Article 1207, it says that the concurrence of two or more creditors or of two or more debtors in one and the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand or that each one of the latter is bound to render the entire compliance with the prestations. There is solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. It doesn't mean na kung meron daw two or more creditors or two or more debtors, automatic solidary na ang inyong obligation. Kailan nagiging solidary ang inyong liability? Only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Article 1208 states that if from the law or the nature or the wording of the obligations to which the preceding articles refer, the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors, the credits or debts being considered distinct from one another, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. Article 1208 speaks of joint obligations. Lahat po ng obligations, kapag hindi sinasabing solidary siya, automatic, it is joint, which is very different from solidary liability. Solidary liability is always dictated by the obligation, the law, and the nature of the obligation itself. Pag si Article 1208, kapag walang sinabi, automatic, it is presumed to be joint obligation. Remember from the picture itself, joint and solidary, kapag joint pa iba-iba. Kapag ka solidary, lahat nagkakaisa. Now, unsay difference sa joint and solidary obligation? Pag malibog mo, you always refer to this one. Ang joint obligation to each his own, kanya-kanya. While solidary obligation means one for all for one. What is solidary obligation? Since nakadiscuss naman ta what is joint obligation, arita sa solidary obligation. Para dali mahinumduman unsa ang solidary obligation, act of one is the act of all, or one for all for one. Each one of the debtors is bound to render, and or each one of the creditors has the right to demand from any of the debtors the entire compliance with the prestation. Timanin ninyo, sa solidary obligation, each one nga kada debtor o each one nga kada creditor. Okay? Each one of the debtor is bound to render, maski kinsa sa inyo ha, kinahanglan mo bayad, o maski kinsa pod sa mga creditor ang pwede maningil. Unsa yang paninglon, unsa imong bayaran, the entire obligation. Kung ang imong bahin sa utang is 30,000 lang, pero kamong tulo ng utang og 90,000, kung maningil ang isa ka creditor, ang imong bayaran dili 30,000, but ang utang pod appeal sa imong ikaduha o ikatulo nga palautang. Kung tulo mo kabuok ng utang og 90,000, whenever you enter into a contract, kay example ng utang mo, na-enter mo og contract of loan, makabalo mo nga ang inyong utang is solidary kung kini nga mga terms na If for example in the contract it is stated that the obligation to borrow 90,000 is joint solidarily, ibig sabihin, solidary ang inyong obligation. Kung ang contract ninyo na ay jointly and severally, in solidum, individually and collectively, each will pay the whole value. I promise to pay with two or more signatures na ay nakabutang nga I promise to pay pero duha mo ni pirma masking pag ay imong gigamit, o kung naani nga word jutos o separadamente, ibig sabihin your contract is a solidary obligation. It is solidary in nature. Unsay solidary? The act of one is the act of all. All for one, one for all. What then are the different kinds of solidary obligation? We have active solidary, passive solidary, and mixed solidary obligation. Let us first discuss active solidarity. When we say active solidarity, this is solidarity on the part of the creditors, where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. So for example, si A, B, C nangutang kang D, E, F. Si D pwede maningil kang A, ang bayaran ni A the entire obligation, because remember, active solidarity means solidarity on the part of the creditors, where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. When we say active solidarity, it also means the authority of each creditor to claim and enforce the rights of all other creditors. So for example, nangutang ka sa tulo ka tao, any one of them can ask for the fulfillment of the obligation. Ikaw may ning bayad, you also have the right nga maningil sa imong kauban nga pala utang. This is what we call mutual representation. So for example, we have creditor 1, pero napod kay creditor 2 and creditor number 3. So for example, if nanghiram ka og 90,000 kang C1, C2, and C3, si C3 pwede mo demand sa imuha nga, huy, bayari ang imong utang. Pila imong ibayad kay C, the entire obligation, which is 90,000. Solidarity on the part of the creditors where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. Kung si C1 naningil sa imo og 90,000, you have to pay the entire obligation to C1. Kung mobayad na ka, asa ka mobayad kay C1. Now, it is the obligation of C1 to give 30,000 to C3 and to give the other 30,000 to C2. Remember, active solidarity means solidarity on the part of the creditor. Mo na siya active solidarity. Another example, we have debtor, we also have C1, C2, and C3. So kung nangutang ka sa ilahag 90,000, unsay mahitabo, each creditor represents others in receiving payment. If he receives only partial, he must divide it among other creditors. So kung si C1 naningil sa imuha, ibig sabihin, ang naningil pun sa imuha si C2 o si C3. Kung ang imong utang 90,000, ang imong gibayad 45,000 lang, that 45,000 will be divided by C1, C2, and C3. What else will happen under active solidarity, which is solidarity on the part of the creditor? He can interrupt period of prescription or render debtor in default for the benefit of all other creditors. So kung si C1 naningil kang debtor, may nga si C1 ay in default na ka, late na ka, mag-interest na ka, ang statement ni C1 mo po na statement ni C2 ug ni C3. For example, nag-promise si debtor nga dapat niya bayaran May 15, 2023 ang iyang utang. What if namatay si C3? Death of one solidary creditor does not transmit the solidarity to each of his heirs, but all of them taken as one. So kung namatay ni si C3, ang iyahang right mabalhin sa iyang tanang heirs. Pero dapat ang tanang heirs isarapud og action. Now, what if nangutang si debtor og 90,000 kang C1, C2, and C3? The benefits are divided equally among creditors unless there is an agreement to divide differently. So for example, si C1, C2, C nagpautang kay debtor og 90,000, pero niya na si C1 nga 20,000 lang ang ibayad sa kuha, kamunay maghati sa uban. Therefore, you have to follow that agreement. Once the credit is collected, an accounting and distribution of the amount should follow. Balik ta sa atong example under situation number 3. Kung si debtor nang utang og 90,000 kang C1, C2, C3, pero ilang nasabutan 35 kang C1, 35 kang C2, 20 kang C3, mao na dapat ang i-follow. Pwede ba nga si C1 ang naningil, ang ibayad lang ni debtor is 35,000? Nya mayon si debtor, C1, imuha ra gyud na kay mura na kong kwarta, pwede ba? Dili na pwede. Because if that happens, it now becomes a joint obligation that is no longer solidarity. Because remember, unsa ingon ni solidarity, kung maningil si C1 dito kang debtor, nya 35,000 lang ibayad ni debtor, si 35,000 must be automatically divided to C2 and C3. What is passive solidarity? Example, kini si D3, D2 ug D1 nangutang og 90,000 kang creditor. So karon na pod daghan na pod ang atuang debtor. What happens in passive solidarity? Kung maningil si creditor dito kang D1, D1 must pay the entire amount to the creditor. Pero si D1 maningil na ngadto kang D3 ug maningil kang D2. The moment maningil si creditor, pila dapat ang bayaran ni D1? 90,000 gyud. Ma'am, mapurdoy si D1, dili siya mapurdoy. Nga naman, paninglon man niya si D2 o si D3. That is passive solidarity. Passive solidarity is solidarity on the part of the debtors where any one of them can be made to answer for others. Additionally, the right of the debtor-payer to recover from others their respective share also exists. So, kung ikaw ang nibayad sa 90,000, na kay right maningil sa 30,000 kang dito o another 30,000 kang D3. Remember, passive solidarity means solidarity on the part of the debtor. So, kinitong example ganiha, Each debtor can be required to pay the entire obligation but can recover from co-debtors their respective share. Again, kung naningil si creditor kang D1, si D1 naman yung ipaningil. So, 30,000 ra bang ibayad ni D1? No. Because your obligation is solidary. Ang bayaran ni D1 if maningil si creditor is the entire 90,000. D1 now has to recover from his co-debtors their respective share. So, si D1 maningil og 30k kang D2, si D1 maningil po og 30k kang D3. The debtor required to pay may set up by way of compensation his own claim against the creditor. So since ikaw man ang nibayad, mo compensate po na siya sa imong paninglon ngadto sa uban. All debtors are liable for the loss even if such loss is caused only by one of them or by fortuitous event after one debtor incurred delay. So for example, gusto na ni D1 mo bayad dito kang creditor kay naningil man si creditor og 90,000. What if nawala ni D1 ang 90,000 unsay mahitabo? All debtors, D2, D3, and D1 are liable for the loss. So kung nanghiram mo diha og sakyanan, nawala ang sakyanan, ang nakawala si D1, kamong tulo ang mobayad. Interest due to delay of one is borne by all of them. So for example, nagsabot-sabot lang mo D1, D2, and D3. Tara mo ato kay creditor, mangutang tag 90,000. Ako 30,000, imuha dito 30,000, ikaw po D3 30,000. Pero kung maningil sa ako si creditor, maningil po ko sa inyo pwede man mo magsabot ana. But the moment naningil si creditor kang D1, dili ibig sabihin nga 30,000 ang ibayad ni D1. Ang ibayad ni D1 is the entire 90,000. Karon, wala man ibayad si D3. So ang inyong nabayad kay creditor is 60,000 lang. Therefore, na-interest nga naman, wala ni bayad si D3. The interest due to delay of one is borne by all of them. So, kamong tulo gihapon ang mobayad sa interest. Now, solidary obligation, according to source, we have conventional, legal, and real. When we say conventional, solidary obligation must be agreed upon by the parties. Dili siya pareha sa joint obligation na presumed. It can be legal, imposed by law, unsa man na. Kung nanghiram kag sakyanan, dili man na pwede hati-hatian, therefore kamong tulo ang mag-bear sa loss, kamo pong tulo ang mobayad. Or it can be a real obligation which is imposed by the nature of the obligation. Again, by way of review, let us discuss joint obligation and solidary obligation. So presumption by law, unsa gani ang joint obligation? It is presumed kung sa inyong contract na ay nakabutang nga proportionately, joint simply, man kumonda, pro rata, we promise to pay. Kung kini sila tanan nakabutang, ibig sabihin ang inyong obligation joint. But ma'am, what if wala ni nakabutang? What if wala ng mga terms? Automatic. It is presumed that your obligation is joint. Unsa nga ni ang joint? To each his own. Kanya-kanya. How about solidary obligation? What is the presumption of the law? Solidary obligation is not presumed. Kinahanglan, it must be stipulated by the parties, law, and the nature of obligation. Kinahanglan sa inyo mismong kontrata na ay nakabutang nga ang obligation is solidary. Unsa gani ang mga terms sa solidary obligation? Joint solidarily, jointly and severally, in solidum, individually and collectively. Each will pay the whole value. I promise to pay with 2 or more signatures and jutos o separadamente. Again, kung naato nga mga term, ibig sabihin solidary ang inyong obligation. Kung walay mga term, buot ipasabot, the obligation is joint obligation. Pero kung kadto nga mga terms naa, ibig sabihin your obligation is solidary. What is now the liability when it is a joint obligation? Proportionate portion of the debt, kanya-kanya. Pag solidary, the entire obligation. Ang inyong bayaran, your liability is the entire obligation. Let us now go to the right of the creditor to the fulfillment of the obligation. Kung joint obligation, kung sa right ni creditor, each is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. But when it comes to solidary, each has the right to demand from any debtor the fulfillment of the entire obligation. Again, pag joint obligation ka, unsay karapatan nimo, kay ikaw may nagpautang, ang imong karapatan is maningil ra sa imong proportionate share. Pero kung solidary ang obligation, naa kay karapatan to demand the entire obligation. We are done, so prepare for a quiz.